ask Patrick a question? I was going to ask him before. There's always a question of not just what is the situation we're in, but how do we get there, and what motivates the people behind it. Which is, it's something I studied in my book. But you mentioned specifically the welfare state, and I think that various speakers have mentioned the NHS, the idea of the NHS being cost money, or socialised healthcare in Europe, and even in America where there's less socialised healthcare, people will say it's pushing up my insurance and so forth. How much do you think that the welfare state is used as an excuse to push these measures, and how far are these measures the product of having a welfare state?
I think there's no question that the welfare state provides an instrument, or a club, I should say, with which the anti-tobacco movement has been able to effectively beat down on the industry and, more importantly, on smokers themselves, making the argument, as you suggested in your question, that we must care what other people are doing to themselves because it costs the rest of us money. Without going into too long or technical a discussion, the bottom line is that all of the reliable research is pretty clear-cut, and that is that smokers actually save us money, they don't cost us money. And that's for a variety of reasons, most of which are too politically incorrect to mention, I don't know, perhaps even at this meeting. But that being the case, the argument, the sort of negative externality argument, as the economists would say, is really moot. But because that position that I just articulated has not been, well, you might say it's not only not been accepted, it's barely been publicized. So we have this discussion over the fact that we all have to pay for other people's sins, which again, perhaps this betrays my sort of libertarian instincts, but I think that the argument that we have a state-run healthcare system means that everyone has to worry about what smokers do themselves is not an argument against smoking. It's an argument for perhaps looking at how we run our healthcare system, because clearly the majority of people could take care of themselves in terms of healthcare, but we have chosen to go another way. If they were taking care of themselves, then they would be, I think, more likely to incorporate into their own calculations the pros and cons of whatever lifestyle choices they make. So it's just another way. The smoking argument, it's moved to obesity. Obesity now apparently costs us all incredible amounts of money. It's another way of reinforcing the notion that there's a collective opinion on these issues, that we all have to be rowing in the same direction, that it's a top-down way of policy making, and that the constraints on individual choice and individual autonomy are only going to expand unless and until, as we discussed this morning, there's some kind of serious reaction to them.
All right.
I'd like to add to that a little bit, if I may. I talked earlier about the United Nations, the Economic and Social Council and committees, and part of what the United Nations founding principles is the precautionary principle. And that essentially says, in a very narrow-minded nutshell, is we're all sick and they have to make us better. So if, again, you go to the source of the problem and fix the source, the rest of it, the issue, will take care of itself, in my opinion. The concept that they know better for us and therefore they have to do national health care, they have to do tobacco bans, they have to do obesity control, they have to do alcohol control, they have to make you wear seat belts, they have to make you wear helmets on your motorbike, is all part of the precautionary principle way of thinking. So again, we go back to the United Nations, back to the Economic Social Council and Committee, and the organizations that are part of that, and that's where that comes from.
Well, looking at the source of these problems is a very complex thing. We have to ask ourselves how did these lines of thinking invade the United Nations, or how did these people conquer all these institutions? How is the EU made up? How are the United Nations made up? They're made up by national governments primarily. I mean, in the EU, okay, the national governments as such, their role is shrinking, whereas, of course, national politicians elected by national electorates in the European Parliament are still, or are becoming a little bit more important. So this is all derived from the activities of national governments, which in turn haven't always been prohibitionist. Yeah, they became prohibitionist after they were conquered by prohibitionists. So the source is somewhere else. We have to dig a little bit deeper in terms of the international system. Strong part of it, an important role is of course the American, the US government being a major player in all these international institutions, which is not prohibitionist by its constitution from the 18th century, on the contrary, but by certain forces that in history have always, at times, have been able to invade that government, and these are sources that are rooted somewhere in society, and it's important to identify them, because that is where it started, with prohibitionist ideology and organizations, some individuals, then small, then bigger organizations, and their power to lobby. Yeah, one of the first paid lobbyists ever in Washington, D.C. was a person from the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the, I guess, in the late 19th century, lobbying for alcohol prohibition. That's also proves people wrong who say that lobbying is mainly a kind of business thing where it's about financial interest. No, there have always been very successful. There has always been very successful lobbying by prohibitionists, by ideological fanatics, and that's where it started from. Now we have the public health system with lots of professionals on that, that earn their money with that kind of thing, and so we have to identify these people, ideological fanatics, public health guys, and now, of course, in the past 20, 25 years, increasingly big pharma, and that's basically the source of it, and yeah, and that's how, and that's what made all these governments, or that was what brought them on the prohibitionist route.
Michael McFadden, if I could ask you, we often talk with the assumption that people do want more freedom, but it often seems as if actually people are quite happy to sacrifice a remarkable amount of their liberty. Do you think people think is freedom is their main thing, really?
I forget at the moment who one of our early presidents, I think maybe Thomas Jefferson, said once that anyone who's willing to sacrifice some of their little of their liberty in order to get a little more security doesn't deserve either one.